Who counts as upper middle class? For that matter, who counts as middle class? It turns out that almost all Americans think of themselves as middle class. And there was a Pew Research survey that found that only 10% of Americans identify as lower class, and only 1% of Americans identify as upper class. So, Denny, how do we how do we parse through this? Who counts as middle class? Who counts as upper middle class? Uh,
And doesn't it depend a lot on economy, right? I mean, like the economy right now is probably pushing people all over the place.
well, it does. And I was actually just reading this morning about how a new study shows that roughly 1 in 10 Americans are now millionaires. Um, and they're obviously not all out there eating caviar and drinking champagne every night and flying on private jets, right? I mean, being a millionaire today is just not what it was 30 years ago. This notion of middle class, upper class, lower class, it is a little nebulous. That being said, we want to talk through some of the actual data today and actually define what that might mean to be upper middle class uh, and how that can shift in different states, different cities as well. Because what what will give you an upper middle class lifestyle in rural Kansas is very different from what will give you an upper middle class lifestyle in Manhattan, for example.
It's
Uh,
so true.
Manhattan, New York City, not Manhattan, Kansas, by the way,
Oh,
which is a place.
I
Uh,
didn't know that.
so on that note, let's walk through some numbers, and then we'll talk about how to actually move yourself into that upper middle class category as quickly as possible if you aren't there yet. All right. So some numbers. There's a couple of different ways that people can define class in this context. One is by net worth. So what Denny and I have talked about for the parameters for upper middle class is the 75th to the 90th percentile. So people who have more than 3/4 than Americans, but less than the top 10% of Americans in wealth or income. So for
And
net worth,
explain, Brian, net worth, exactly what that means.
fair enough. Good point, Denny. So net worth is the total sum of all of your assets minus the sum of all your liabilities and debts. So, for example, if you have $1 million in total assets, including your home and your car and your stock portfolio and your real estate holdings, but you have $300,000 in debts, that means your net worth is $700,000. So a million minus 300,000 equals $700,000, right? So that would be your net worth. All right. So what net worth falls in that 75th to 90th percentile range? Well, it turns out 700,000 would put you in that range. 75th percentile for net worth in the US is $658,340. And the 90th percentile in net worth is 1.9 million, roughly $1,920,758. And this is data from the current population survey, by the way, from the US government. All right, so net worth is one way of doing it. So roughly $658,000 net worth to roughly $1.92 million would put you in that 75th to 90th percentile range, if that's how you want to define upper middle class by net worth. Now, you can also define net worth by income, right? So the income method here, if we are looking at that same stretch of percentile, 75th percentile to 90th percentile, that would require an income between roughly $145,000 and roughly $235,000 per year. And this is household income, by the way, not individual income.
Oh, good point.
Denny, yeah, any thoughts on that before we go on to the next income method for
Just, somebody from my age seeing these kind of numbers compared to how they were like when I was in my 20s blows my mind.
Well, and that goes to the question of inflation, right? And this is why we as real estate investors are big on hedging against inflation and
Yes.
using real assets like real estate to combat inflation and protect our assets from inflation. Stock, I mean, I'm a big stock investor as well, and stocks also provide some hedge against inflation, not quite as good as real estate, but stock do provide some protection against inflation. You know what doesn't protect you from inflation? Bonds. Everyone talks about how safe bonds are. But the fact is, yes, bonds have low default risk, but they have high interest rate risk and high inflation risk. So anyway, going on a little bit of a tangent there, but coming back to who counts as middle class, upper middle class. So one other way of looking at this, Go Banking Rates, who, for full transparency, I do some writing for as a financial writer. They ran a study earlier in 2025, and they were counting middle class as anyone earning between 2/3 the median income and double the median income. So
big range.
Well, but that's part of the point, is that like everyone thinks that they're middle class, right? So that's how they were defining middle class: 2/3 of median income to double the median income. So nationwide, and by the way, for median income, we're using the most recent Census Bureau data, which is outdated. It's from 2023, but it's the most recent Census Bureau data available. That puts the household median income at $80,610. So 2/3 of that would be around 54,000. Double that would be around 161,000. So that would be nationwide. We're talking nationwide average. That would be the range for what counts as middle class. Roughly 54,000 to 161,000. That would be the range for middle class household income. People earning above 161,000 in this case would be considered upper middle class. They didn't put an upper boundary on that, at least in that study. Now, that varies a lot by state, and this was actually where that Go Banking Rate study got more interesting, is that it broke down for each state what counts as middle class or upper middle class, and the cheapest state for counting, the lowest income state, was Mississippi. So in order to reach that upper middle class threshold in Mississippi, all you have to earn is $85,400 a year as household income.
Wow.
And we'll link to that study in the show notes as well.
Now, I'm just curious. I mean, I know in Pennsylvania, there are localities that are very, very different with income.
Oh, sure.
Average income. So I guess that also is all places.
Yeah, so again, Manhattan, Kansas versus Manhattan, New York City, huge variation in what will actually buy you what we would consider an upper middle class lifestyle, right? And what is a middle class income in these two extremes of places. So yeah, it is, a lot of this is subjective. A lot of it is location dependent. I mean, I have a good friend who earns a good living. He's a real estate syndicator, actually. And Denny, you and I have considered investing with him in the co-investing club. He lives in San Francisco, and he lives in a pretty modest house. And he and his wife spend it was over $5,000 a month on rent for a modest apartment. In fact, they were living in a house and they were spending like $8,100 a month on rent for a pretty modest middle class style house, and they just downsized into an apartment, paying over $5,000. And this is a modest apartment; it's not a fancy apartment.
That's just crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. So yeah, it all varies depending on where you live. So, all right, are we ready to move on about how to get there faster, or is there anything else you wanted to discuss about who counts as middle class, upper middle class, etc.?
No, I think we got it. Let's move forward and see how we can get it rolling.
All right. So first things first, the fastest way to bump yourself into a higher class category and a higher income bracket in general is just to earn more income, right, as a household. So that could mean getting a raise. It could mean putting yourself in a new career track with higher earnings and earning potential. It could mean taking on side hustles. It could mean one spouse going back to work, for example. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but raising your household income is what's going to move the needle the fastest here. That aside, since Denny and I are not career counselors, let's talk about investments, because that is what we do and know best. Earning higher returns on your investments is going to help you get there faster too. In the co-investing club, we get together every month as a club of investors, and we vet different deals. And we're looking for those high return potential deals with low to medium potential risk. So we are aiming for returns in the mid-teens or higher annualized. But we're looking for, again, like low to medium risk on these.
And because there's such a minimum amount needed to even get involved, that reduces your risk even more because you can spread it.
That's right. Yeah, you can spread smaller amounts of money across more investments and hedge against risk that way as well. Instead of having to invest the typical $50,000, $100,000, $250,000 that you would ordinarily need to invest in private equity real estate by yourself. So that's one thing. And, you know, having 50 sets of eyeballs on these investments and all vetting them together, like we do in the co-investing club, that also really hedges against risk as well. Helps you reduce risk for these and analyze risk with clear and open eyes. Adding passive income streams, multiple passive income streams, that will help you get to upper middle class faster. So that does both, right? You want to, earn the higher returns and bumping up your household income at the same time. A couple of examples just from stuff we've invested in recently in the co-investing club. Some of the syndications that we invest in, they pay 8% distribution yields, sometimes higher. So every quarter,
more than a bond.
Well, more than most funds, yeah, certainly. And we are equity owners in those properties, so inflation, we're protected against inflation, even as we're earning those higher yields. Those properties also appreciate in value over time too, and as inflation drives up rents, that drives up the NOI, the net operating income of these properties, raises the value of the properties, raises what we collect in distributions. It all helps. We have invested in debt investments as well. So, for example, within the last month or two, we invested in a secured note to a real estate investment firm. The owner of that firm offered us a first position lien against his home, his primary residence, as collateral, with a low LTV. I think the LTV on that was like 65%. But that's paying 15% interest. So every quarter he pays a 15% interest. That gets spread out to all of the people like myself who invested in that note. We invested in a real estate equity fund with a land investing company called Meridian. They pay 16% distribution yields. So every quarter they send out those distributions at 16% annualized yield. It's great. These are adding real income streams for me, for the other members of the co-investing club.
Right.
Which is great, creating all of these multiple income streams at pretty high yields. Real estate also lets you leverage other people's money. So, if you're an active investor, Denny and I are no longer active real estate investors. We are passive real estate investors. We invest as just two more members of the co-investing club. But for active real estate investors, leveraging other people's money is super valuable, super helpful. And I'll give you a really quick example of this using really simple numbers of how this works. So then let's say that you go out and you spend $100,000 to buy a rental property, right? And let's say that you get an 80% LTV loan. So $80,000 of that 100,000 was paid for by the bank offering you a mortgage. So you put down $20,000, right? With me so far? Okay.
Yep.
In the first year, it appreciates by a very normal average 4%. That raises the property value from $100,000 to $104,000. But that $4,000 gain in property value, that translates to a 20% return on your $20,000 cash down payment for that property, right? So in just that first year alone, you had a 20% return just from 20% return on your cash, your $20,000 cash from your own money. You got a 20% return on that just from appreciation alone. That doesn't even include any of the cash flow. So that is an example of how leveraging other people's money can help you earn outsized returns on your real estate investments.
And that would also help your net worth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that drives up your net worth as well. And there's a concept that is worth explaining here. This is another way to reach upper middle class faster. There's an investment concept in real estate called infinite returns. And the idea here is that you go out you invest your money in real estate, either actively or passively. The classical example is active investment called the BRRRR strategy: buy, renovate, rent, refinance, repeat. And the idea is you're flipping a house to yourself and keeping it as a rental property. So you buy a fixer-upper, you go out, you renovate it to bump up the value by a ton. And then instead of selling it to a homeowner, you refinance it and you keep it as a rental. And when you refinance it, you pull your down payment back out of the property. So now you have no money tied up in the property, none of your own cash, rather. But you have rent coming in, probably not at a huge cash flow since you have it pretty leveraged. But you have rent coming in, you have a little bit of cash flow, and it's appreciating in value every year. But the big thing is you've gotten your down payment back out of that property. You can go out and reinvest that money again and again and again and again, and just keep building a portfolio of rental properties with that same down payment. You're recycling the same down payment to keep buying properties, each of which adds cash flow to your income. It adds appreciation each year for your net worth. And over time, you build up a huge portfolio of properties. Now, the same concept applies in passive real estate investments. Denny, you and I have invested in the co-investing club in properties that do this on a much larger scale,
Right.
where an operator, a syndicator will go in, they'll buy an apartment complex, they'll spend a year or two renovating it and adding value that way. The renovated units rent for much higher amounts. That drives up the NOI, that drives up the property value, and then they refinance the property, pull our money, they pull that money back out from the bank, and they give us our money back, our investment. So we get our money back. We can go out and reinvest it in other things, stocks, more real estate syndications, or equity funds, debt funds, private notes, or rental properties, or whatever. We get our money back. We can reinvest it elsewhere, but we keep our ownership percentage in that apartment complex, keep earning cash flow and distributions from it. It keeps appreciating in value. And eventually, 5 years later, whatever, they sell the property. We get our big cash out. Everybody, goes home. So infinite return. That's another way to help you join the upper middle class. And finally, tax benefits. So there's a strategy that we love in the co-investing club called the lazy 1031 exchange. And if you guys are familiar with traditional 1031 exchanges, they're a big pain in the rear. I mean, you have to go out and you have to hire a qualified intermediary to hold your money when you sell your original property. And you have to declare the new property.
There's strict time frames.
Yeah, so 45 days to declare the new property, the replacement property. You have to settle in that property within 180 days of selling the old property. All kinds of rules and costs and regulations. So I don't do any of that with my own investments. Even when I was buying properties directly as an active investor, I didn't do that. It was just too much work. The lazy 1031 exchange basically gives you the same thing without all those headaches and all those hassles. So the way it works is you invest passively in a syndication or a fund or whatever, and then you get your money back after a few years, whatever it is. The property sells, you get your money back plus all of your profits and gains. Now that leaves you with a capital gains tax bill, right? And depreciation recapture. So you owe a big tax bill to the IRS. So what do? Take that money that you got back and your profits, or at least some of them, and you reinvest it in a new syndication. And that new syndication will give you that huge upfront tax write-off from depreciation. And in fact, the recent tax law, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, was one of the changes that it made was it made permanent. I know, right? But it made permanent that 100% depreciation write-off in the first year for these properties. So you get a huge tax write-off in year one when you invest in a real estate syndication. And you can use that to offset your gains from a property that's sold. So you don't have to mess around with qualified intermediaries. You don't have to mess around with timelines like the 45-day rule, the 180-day rule. All you have to do is just invest money in a new syndication in the same calendar year as the old one sold. So super easy. You don't have to do anything, but it's a way to keep punting the tax bill forward into the future indefinitely. All right, Denny, any thoughts that you want to add, or anything we didn't get to, talking about who counts as upper middle class or how to get there faster?
No, I think you covered it all. And I obviously, I just like the whole real estate. We all know that. Although we did just, does metals have anything to do with increasing your net worth?
So metals, precious metals like gold and silver, tend to be more of a defensive play, more of a hedge against inflation, a hedge against geopolitical risk. A hedge against the loss of purchasing power of the U.S. dollar or other fiat currencies. It's also a hedge against stock market crashes. So when stock markets crash, people tend to retreat to the safe haven of gold and silver. So that's more of a defensive play. A lot, especially wealthier people, will typically add some precious metals to their portfolio as a wealth preservation tactic, as opposed to a building wealth tactic.
Gotcha.
Something to keep in mind as you join the upper middle class, right? Maybe something to do. So I just myself added some gold and silver to my own portfolio to help protect the wealth that I'm building.
It's very cool.
All right. Well, guys, if you got a fresh perspective out of this episode, please subscribe, pass it on to friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, and reach out. Let us know what you want to hear more about. Support@sparkrental.com. And if you're new to the idea of passive real estate investing, we have a free course on it, on 5 different passive real estate investments that you probably never heard of or aren't familiar with. Check it out at sparkrental.com/free. It's 8 videos. They're all like quick and snappy, like 10 minutes long. So check it out. Let us know what you think. And on that note, stay weird, unconventional investor.